We obviously want to encourage great people to get into restaurants, and the only way we're going to do that, I think, is by having education, by having structure and having support around A, what it takes to be successful in the industry, and B, how you can do that, without honestly having to work 90 or 100 hours a week.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. In Australia, most restaurants are family-run hubs of the community, places where we gather to socialise, break bread, and forget our woes. For those that grow up in family restaurants, their careers are often predestined to carry on the work of their parents. Others leave the fold for different vocations, and some take the solid foundation built over their childhood and take on the world. Banjo Harris Plane is the co-founder of Grow Assembly and Good Pair Day. Banjo, how are you?
I'm fantastic, Huck. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us. You've had a pretty amazing career, which we can go into, but it all sort of started in the early days with a family restaurant for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very privileged in retrospect to look at my childhood as it was kind of linked to a lot of fantastic food and wine. Both my parents didn't come from families where food and wine was important, but throughout their sort of young adult lives and as they were growing up, they certainly became bon vivants, shall we say, that they really loved food and wine and restaurants, and it really became a part of their personal identity. My mother trained as a chef. My dad was a journalist and travelled all over the world, and they both developed a love for delicious and interesting food and mostly Australian wine, to be honest. And when I was quite little, they bought their first restaurant. They bought a little a B&B and a restaurant in a South Australian country town called Robe. We moved there from Adelaide, and some of my earliest memories are of walking the hallways of that B&B, being in the courtyard while breakfast was served, and it just kind of took off from there. They bought another restaurant in Adelaide after that, and we moved back to Adelaide. And food and wine's always been a really big part of my life, and it's really all thanks to them.
Were there ever any moments when you were growing up when you thought that you needed to move away and not have a career in hospitality before that became your thing?
Look, it kind of happened organically, I guess. I worked in my parents' restaurant throughout high school. Friday, Saturday nights, I would do shifts, either polishing glasses or helping out on the floor. Some Saturday mornings I would go and help my dad do stock take in the cellar. And then after I finished university, I got a really great offer from one of my aunts who's also in the industry. Look, my whole family is really heavily connected to the restaurant industry. I've got two aunts who are both really well recognised chefs, and one of them, her name's Christine Manfield. She'd been asked to head up a restaurant in London, and she said, "Look, why don't you come to London now that you've got your study out of the way? Come and work here. It'll be an incredible experience." So I'd spent pretty much my whole adult life up until that time in Adelaide. So to have a job in what was definitely going to be a busy restaurant across the world in London was an eye-opening experience. And that really set me on the path, I guess, being in London, in a vaunted restaurant. We were getting a lot of press. It was busy. There was lots of stuff happening. It was ultimately unsuccessful, but at the time that I was there, it was really busy. And, that really opened my eyes to food and wine and restaurants and really set me on the path.
The food scene in Adelaide has evolved beautifully over the last decade or so. But take us back to that time when you were at school and university and working in your parents' restaurant. What was the restaurant offerings like in Adelaide in those days?
Look, I probably don't have a great memory of the industry as a whole back then because I wasn't as deeply committed to it. It was kind of, for me, it was a job at the time. I liked hanging out, because I knew all the people there and the restaurant was comfortable. It wasn't a standard job. I think anyone who's worked for their parents kind of knows that it's not the same environment as a traditional workplace. but their restaurant was definitely a fine dining restaurant. It was well recognised at the time. The food was, that kind of famous Australian mid-90s Asian fusion kind of thing, even though if I said that to my parents now, they'd probably be angry with me for describing it as such. But look, the restaurant scene back then in Adelaide was probably limited compared to what's available now. But at the time, it seemed quite wonderful. I definitely have very fond memories of working in the restaurant there, of the environment, of the service, of everything that we did. I thought it was a wonderful introduction to the world of restaurants and fine dining.
You went to university before diving into your career in London with Christine Manfield. What were you studying, and was there thoughts to not go towards hospitality at all?
I was one of those people. I did quite well at school, which was lucky, because I had absolutely bugger all idea of what I wanted to do. So I'd applied for law and didn't quite do well enough to get into that. And so I just ended up doing international studies, which I kind of recall as basically an arts degree with a foreign language. So I did French because I'd been quite good at French at school, and I'd always dreamed of going to Paris. And so I did a lot of humanities subjects. I loved the arts and sort of history, and I loved reading. And I really didn't have a clue. So I was doing that and kind of scraping along and, reading lots of books and not turning in too many assignments. And the world of hospitality drew me in because it was a workplace, but tied to that was the world of wine. And like I said, I was a bit of a geek. I was reading a lot, and so I was just reading all these books about wine as well. And it just seemed like this whole new world that encapsulated, history, geography, different languages, culture, agriculture. It was pretty huge, and it was eye-opening. And I thought, wow, this all seems really, really exciting.
So take us to London. You said it was a pretty eye-opening experience, and then you ended up coming back to Australia. But what changed for you in London? Yeah,
like I said, it was eye-opening. The pace of life was completely different, obviously, but just being in this huge restaurant, 120 odd seats. There was a boutique hotel on the stories above. I think there were 3 or 4 rooms. There was 2 bars. There was a function space, and I'd just never seen anything like it. I was a 20 or 21-year-old kid who'd come from Adelaide, and I didn't really have a clue that restaurants like this existed. I was in the big smoke. And obviously the wine scene in London was and still is one of the best in the world. There's access to wines from every corner of the globe, and it's really, really quite special, from wine, humble wines from, Australia and Chile and South Africa to the great wines of France and Italy, some of the most expensive and rare wines in the world. So we had a pretty solid wine list, and I was going to other places in London that had amazing wine lists and, talking to people and just, sheer osmosis. I was a sponge at that time, just sucking up as much as I could, and came back to Adelaide and, had just spent basically 2 years working in a pretty solid restaurant, and thought, oh yeah, I could probably do this for a bit longer, until I figure out what really happens. And then, 20 years later, here we are.
Well, you've worked at some pretty amazing restaurants in Australia. What's been the real pivotal moments for you through your career with the various restaurants you worked at?
Well, that was definitely the genesis of it. Like we said, in London, I spent a little bit of time in Adelaide before moving to Sydney when I came back to Australia. And I just had some amazing experiences in Sydney, working for some people who are still heavily active in the restaurant industry in Sydney. My first job in Sydney was working at the Bentley restaurant when it was still in Surrey Hills. Nick Hildebrandt was, and still is, the owner, but was a real inspiration to me. I think he's a bit of a pioneer in terms of the kinds of wine lists that he writes in this country and the kinds of wines that he knows about and gets access to and then shows off to his customers. And he's a quiet guy, but he's quietly inspirational as well. I worked for Merivale briefly, and Franck Moreau is the head of everything wine there, and he's also an incredible guy. You know, the first Australian-based Master Sommelier. The Master Sommelier program is a global program, you know, accrediting sommeliers across the world, and he was the first person who lived in Australia to be awarded that, and he leads a huge team of sommeliers across that giant company, and he's also a really inspirational person. And I just felt, you know, I really felt a part of the Sydney hospitality community almost as soon as I arrived there. And, you know, from Bentley to S, and then I worked at Key, and, you know, there were just like massive wine programs. Restaurants were getting global attention. You know, obviously restaurants like Rockpool and Tetsuya's had really put Sydney on the map, and you know, that was continued by the good work that Key did in the mid and late 2000s, and so it was really an exciting time. And there were lots of those, you know, the sort of, I'd call them more casual fine dining places that were starting to evolve in Sydney at that time. It was just a really exciting time to be there.
Attica really got the world's focus as well, and it's been on the top 50 list many times. And you were a key part of that success. What was it like working with Ben Shuri and running that team and living the ride of that success? Yeah,
it really was a ride, to be honest. You know, that would be the seminal job that I had in my hospitality career, I would say. I was living in Sydney, and I wanted to take the next step in my career. I'd had kind of junior management positions, and I had been brought up in restaurants. I loved restaurants. I lived and breathed restaurants. You know, on my days off, I would eat in restaurants. When I was working, I was in restaurants. I had very clear ideas of how I thought restaurants should be run, how wine lists should look, how service should look. You know, I was really developing, I don't want to say I was developing a philosophy, that sounds a bit pompous, but I had a really clear idea of how I thought a good restaurant should operate. And I'd taken a trip to Melbourne with a couple of friends just to go eating, and one of the places that we went to was Attica, and it really stood out for its lack of pretension. You know, it wasn't in the CBD, it wasn't big and flashy, but there was a lot of thought and a lot of care put into everything. And about 6 months after we ate there, a friend of mine in Melbourne said, "Hey, they're advertising for a restaurant manager. Do you think you'd be up for it?" So I applied for the job and I got it. So I moved from Sydney to Melbourne in 2011. And Attica had been awarded the best restaurant in Victoria in the Good Food Guide, I think, the previous year, and we're really starting to make a run at, as you said, what would be a really long stretch of global acclaim. And when I got there, it was really interesting for me. Like I detailed, I'd worked at these big fancy restaurants in Sydney, Est and Key, and you know, they're backed by big money. You know, they're big organisations, they're serious restaurants. They've got HR teams, and they've got, you know, structures and processes and things like that. And the restaurant that I came to in Melbourne, Attica, and this is not a negative comment by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a far more humble restaurant, and it really reminded me of some ways of working for my parents again, because it was a small restaurant. Ben was one of the owners, and a doctor, a guy by the name of David Makora, he was the co-owner at the time, and they just poured everything into it. They did everything themselves. You know, there was no big financial backer. They're out in Rip and Lee. You know, they're not in a cool part of Melbourne, but they were just doing the absolute best they could. And it turns out that what they were doing was pretty awesome. So I came on board, restaurant manager and head sommelier, head of reservations, you know, head cleaner, you know, a bit of everything. It was a small team, but a passionate team. And a lot of that passion stemmed from Ben himself. I think most people listening to this will be familiar with Ben. He's eccentric and wild and passionate and lovely and caring and a little bit crazy. And, you know, a lot of the success of that restaurant stems from his work ethic and his passion. And so that really rubbed off on me. And, you know, I just ended up throwing myself into that job and trying to make this little humble restaurant in Rip and Lee as amazing as it could be. And when I look at how the restaurant was when I started there compared to how it was when I left, look, there were some massive changes. I definitely wasn't to thank for all of them, but I was a part of it, and I'm really proud of that. And it was a really special time. You know, the restaurant was renovated. There was big turnovers of staff. You know, we got new staff and, you know, new systems in place. We built a cellar. We built a private dining room. We tripled the size of the wine list. You know, we built a garden out the back of the restaurant where people are now taken as part of their dining experience. There was crazy stuff happening, and it was all done by hand. You know, it was all done by blood, sweat and tears. So it was pretty epic.
Given the sort of background that you had of some of those really big restaurants and then moving to Attica, with the responsibility of creating this wine list with what Ben was doing, which was so forward-thinking, culinary speaking in Australia, what was it like trying to pull together that wine list for you?
It kind of happened in two parts. When I got there, I was pretty headstrong, I guess. I was like, this is how it's going to be, and I'm going to do it like this. And I think Ben kind of let me have my way for a little while. And then, you know, over a period of, I guess, a year or 18 months, it was kind of like, well, it can't just be this wine list that's, you know, stuff that I want to drink, because, you know, that's cool and people like that, but it needs to fit with the culture of the restaurant. And look, we weren't too far apart, to be honest, so it wasn't a really big catastrophe, but there were changes that needed to be made. You know, the ethos of the restaurant was very local and sustainable. And for a long time, we had, you know, more imported wines than we had Australian wines, so we had to kind of bring the focus back to some local wines, and also just ensuring that, you know, basically as many producers on the wine list as possible were working sustainably or organically, which the majority were, to be honest, but just giving it a bit more focus. I think I kind of lost focus in that first 12 months just because there was so much going on and there was so much that I wanted to change and to make happen. But yeah, look, I was lucky enough to be there for 5 years, and you know, that was a really good stretch of time, and certainly gave us the opportunity to put some really good things into place.
You've won many accolades and Sommelier of the Year on numerous occasions. Natural wines is something that has really come to the fore in the last decade in Australia, and there's always heated debate about natural wines in the wine community. Tell us about putting a wine list together and the sort of the emergence of natural wines and that sort of, I know you've been part of those sort of debates that are ongoing.
Yeah. So when I was living in Sydney, I was studying the Master Sommelier certification, and some of the exams were taking place in London. So I was travelling to London once a year to sit these fiendishly difficult exams and consequently failing these exams. But outside of that, I would go and drink at, you know, fantastic wine bars in London and Paris, and go and visit, you know, different vineyards around Europe. And the wines that were being recommended by sommeliers overseas, or the vineyards that I had read about that we would then go and visit, more often than not were small scale sustainable agriculture, and the winemaking was very low intervention, and the resultant wines were, for me in the mid 2000s, a real breath of fresh air. You know, they were offering flavors and textures that I wasn't familiar with from my drinking history of Australian and classic European wine. And so it seemed like, you know, I'd spent, you know, 5, 6, 7 years learning about the world of wine, and all of a sudden I was getting towards, you know, maybe the end or close to the end of my discovery, and all of a sudden a new gateway opened up, and there was all these new flavors and new stories to talk about and to discover. And so, you know, obviously that was insanely interesting and, you know, very, very exciting. So, you know, coming back to Sydney after some of these adventures overseas, trying to find some of these wines proved difficult, but there were obviously other people going on the same journey, other wine importers and other restaurant owners, and slowly these wines started arriving in Australia from overseas, and at the same time winemakers started making these wines. And so I'd grown up in South Australia, and I had a lot of friends in the wine industry in the Adelaide Hills and in the Barossa Valley and things like that. And the Adelaide Hills, that, you know, today is known as a hotbed of minimal intervention wine. And so it turned out that I I was good mates with a lot of these people like James Erskine and Anton von Klopper and Tom Schaubrook and things like this, who, these guys who are really at the forefront of the minimal intervention wine scene in Australia. And so, these wines were slowly being sold across Australia, and I was drinking them and I was enjoying them, and then I was buying them, and then I was selling them and talking about them, and it just kind of, it really picked up pace. It really snowballed, I think, in the late 2000s until, we get to where we are today, where it's I don't even think it's a debate anymore. I mean, some people still maybe like to argue about it, but I think the natural wine scene is so embedded in the world of wine. It's just a part of the greater world of wine. Everyone knows that there are wines that are made like this. As the years go by, there are less and less minimal intervention wines that are faulty or off or, horrible to drink, because there definitely were some pretty rough bottles getting around a few years back, but that's less and less, and now they're just a part. They're just a thread in the fabric of the whole world of wine, and I think that's utterly brilliant.
You ended up leaving Attica and with a group of other people opening Bar Liberty and Capitano. Tell us what it was like opening your own restaurant, given the background that you'd had of your family's restaurant and such big restaurants that you'd been part of, to create something a lot smaller and really a representation of where you were at.
Yeah, so this is going to be a common theme, but when I left Attica again, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was still trying to figure out adult life, and I'd been there for 5 years, and like I said, I still had that really clear idea of what I wanted a restaurant to be, how I wanted it to operate, and I felt like I had done a lot of stuff at Attica, but I was never going to be the owner of the restaurant. So it kind of coincided with the timing of Ben taking full ownership of the restaurant. So he bought out the other owner, and he became the sole owner. Full power to him. And I kind of realized that whilst there was still incredible opportunity to do amazing things at that restaurant, it wouldn't be, for me at least, from a position of full power, from full autonomy, from full decision making. And I guess I kind of wanted to be in that position. So I left Attica, and about 6 months later reunited with a guy who had been the assistant restaurant manager at Attica for a while. His name's Michael Busqueta. And we teamed up with two blokes who at the time owned basically a chicken shop on Smith Street called Rockwell and Sons. And we said, we're going to do basically a wine bistro. We're going to make a place that would be somewhere that we'd want to go on our days off. It's going to be built around, I don't want to call it fine dining hospitality, but I want to call it like innate or true hospitality, where it's really at the heart of everything that we do. We want the selection of drinks to be amazing, but we want it to be relaxed. We want apprentice chefs to be able to come in there. We want, anyone to be able to stop in, spend $50, have a great something to eat and glass of wine, and not make it too unapproachable. And so that was in 2016. We opened Bar Liberty on Johnson Street in Fitzroy. They just celebrated 5 years, and I'm super proud of my time there. I think we did what we set out to do, which is always a big tick. We created a casual wine-focused hospitality venue that made people happy. We did some cool things. We had interesting drinks, and all the snacks were delicious. And I think it's a good place. I think it's a really nice place.
One of the really interesting and amazing things that you've been involved with is Grow Assembly, and you've put on quite a few of them. Can you tell us about how that started and how important you believe it is for the hospitality sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my last year at Attica, I'll just give you a bit of backstory. My last year at Attica, I was invited to speak at a conference in New York City called the Welcome Conference, which was put together by Will Gadara, who was formerly the co-owner of 11 Madison Park, and a guy called Anthony Rudolph, who was formerly the GM of Per Se. So two kind of front of house heavyweight titans in New York City, sort of long-time restaurant professionals, came together with the idea and said, we want to put on a hospitality conference that's not about rock star chefs. We want it to be about front of house. So, waiters, restaurant managers, HR department, sommeliers, bartenders, baristas. We want it to be about the front of house. And they very kindly invited me to come to New York and talk about Attica and talk about hospitality. And I did that, and it was an eye-opening moment. To be in a room. There must have been a crowd of 500 people in this auditorium where I gave this talk, and there were other huge names giving talks. I was very much down the bottom of the roster in terms of well-known names. There was this guy called John Batiste who's a musician, and he's put together film soundtracks, and he was talking about his journey. There was the founder of Chipotle. There was this guy called Dani Meyer, who's probably the best known hospitality professional in all of North America. There was some big names, and it was really inspirational to listen to them talk, but also to see the reaction from all of the hospitality crowd in New York. And people had flown from across America to come to this thing. And I came back to Australia, and I was like, that was fucking amazing. That was what I want to be a part of. That, in my mind, elevated the art and craft of hospitality to something truly professional. And without it being a negative, I think that's sometimes missing in people's hospitality journey. I know that a lot of people come to hospitality exactly as I did, without really knowing where they wanted to get to or what they were doing. And I don't think that is... I don't think that makes anything less of the hospitality industry, your pathway to it. But I also think that there should be some sort of structure and architecture to give people the professionalism and the tools that they need to really succeed in what can be a really challenging industry. And I kind of looked around, and I didn't really see a lot of that. I knew that I didn't have a lot of that when I was coming through working in hospitality. Like I said, I had a clear idea of how I wanted restaurants to work, but at the end of the day, I knew nothing about finance. I knew, bugger all about. I had no formal HR training or how to manage people. It was all done on the fly through osmosis. You work with people. Hopefully, you work with someone good, and they teach you something. You take that and you go to the next venue and you learn something else. And then by the time you're in your mid-30s, you've cobbled together a collection of skills, and you end up opening a restaurant, which is exactly my pathway. And I thought that maybe that there's some space there for additional resources and mentoring and help. So with friends, put together this thing called Grow Assembly, which we wanted to be for the hospitality industry, by the hospitality industry, and we wanted to focus on a holistic view of hospitality. So not just hospitality, but any sort of tangential industry that was also affected by that. So, we had growers and makers and designers and producers, that were all in some way linked to restaurants or hotels or bars or wine or food or, farms or anything like that. And the idea was to basically put people in touch with people who had some success, for those people to share stories of their success, to hopefully inspire and educate, and then for us to create a dialogue around, how these people had become successful, and to give people a resource for future success, so that they could learn about, how to write a roster, or how to analyze a wine stock take sheet to assess profit and loss as it pertains to your beverage program in your restaurant, or how to manage hiring and firing. All of these skills, they're meta skills. They apply across any industry, but people in hospitality, I think, for years have worked long hours and haven't necessarily had the opportunity to skill up in these areas. And I think that's part of what makes running a small or medium-sized restaurant quite challenging.
What impact has Grow Assembly had on you?
It's almost too hard to put into words, and just because of the the people that I've managed to connect with and speak to, and you just realize that, first of all, the stuff that you're going through in a professional sense, and often a personal sense as well, to be honest, is not unique. And that doesn't make you feel bad. That makes you feel, warm and surrounded. The fact that other people are going through the same thing, and you can share that experience, and you can help each other. And just hearing the inspiring stories of so many people who are all passionate food, wine, restaurant professionals, hearing the troubles that they've had, but then the successes that they've had as well. It's a pretty inspiring thing to be a part of when you have people who have these amazing stories so freely giving this information and wanting to inspire and wanting to pass on this information. So I've loved every minute of it. Look, we're set up as a not-for-profit. It doesn't really make any money. We put on events, and we took a hiatus over COVID because everyone who was doing events kind of did that as well, and we're kind of at the start of the second phase of Grow Assembly now, and we're looking to see what the future holds and how we can keep connecting with the hospitality industry around Australia in the coming years, because it's a pretty interesting time.
You're no longer in restaurants, but wine is at the center of what you do. What is Good Pear Days?
Yeah, so Good Pear Days is a business that I co-founded in 2016. I sort of just finishing up at Attica, about to open Bar Liberty, and I got a message on LinkedIn from a guy who was a friend of someone who I went to school with a long time ago. And he was like, "Hey, I'm an ex-Macquarie banker, and I want to start a wine business." And I was kind of like, "Oh yeah, okay, cool." And anyway, his name's Tom. He's my business partner and one of my close friends now. I met with him, and he had this pretty bold plan to, I guess, kind of revolutionise the way that wine is sold in Australia. And it stemmed from he doesn't have a wine background, but he's interested in wine, and he had always experienced difficulty when trying to buy wine, primarily around the way that he would describe what he liked to whoever was trying to sell him wine, and then the recommendations that they would make. He had more misses than he had hits. He didn't understand the jargon and terminology of wine. When ordering wine in a restaurant, he was confused by, regions and vintages and prices and things like this. And he couldn't get his head around it. And when he laid out this plan at the time, I had never thought about such things, but very quickly understood exactly what he was saying. And it made perfect sense, because the wine industry is full of jargon, and it is complex for an outsider, and it is challenging, and it is difficult. And at the end of the day, my belief is that it really shouldn't be, because wine is a social thing, a cultural thing. Everyone should be able to sit down and enjoy a glass of wine, no matter where it comes from. And they should be able to talk about, why they enjoy it. So Tom's idea was to start an online wine business that had education as its key pillar, and to translate the world of wine into something social and fun that everyone could enjoy. So, yeah, Good Pear Days is an online wine business. I started doing it, pretty much simultaneously to opening a restaurant, which, for anyone listening, is a bad idea, trying to start two businesses at once. I was also starting a family, so, many balls in the air. But when I decided to leave, at least for the time being, to leave restaurants, I sold out of the two restaurants that I owned in Melbourne, and made a commitment to, I guess I made a commitment to my family, but I also made a commitment to one business. For a long time I was trying to juggle multiple ideas and multiple businesses, and it seemed like a lot of fun, but and it was a lot of fun, don't get me wrong, but it was also a challenging time, and it makes it hard to give 110% to one thing. So making that decision, the end of 2018, start of 2019, I moved back to Adelaide, and I dedicated myself full time to Good Pear Days, which is now, I'm really proud to say, one of Australia's leading online wine retailers. We have fantastic educational content. We source wine from all around the world, so I use my wine experience to import wines from across Europe and South America and South Africa. So we offer wines that you can't find anywhere else. And we also, I think we sell it in a slightly different way to people. It's at its heart, it's the skills of a sommelier, but on an online platform. So we make wine recommendations based on information that a guest or customer will give to us when they come to their site. We ask them questions about things that they like and don't like, and we use that to generate wine recommendations for people.
Your career has been about education and creating change in hospitality in many ways. The industry has had the toughest year that it could possibly have. What sort of positive changes do you think can come out of what the industry's gone through?
It's been a wild time, hasn't it? I don't think anyone's seen anything like it in the hospitality industry, and hopefully we never will again. But at the same time, you can only look forward. You can only try and find the positives in such a time, and I think for a lot of people, it's been a reset. It's been a moment to sort of pause and to breathe and to see a few minutes into the future rather than just focusing on exactly what's in front of you at any given time. So I hope and I believe that a lot of smart restaurant people will use this in the coming years to, I guess, reshape or reform how restaurants are run. We can probably hardly remember it now, but pre all the COVID issues, there were big rumblings about overwork and about how restaurants were structured and how people were paid, and that's still a big issue that's kind of bubbling away. But there have been other things that have kind of taken our time and attention. But hopefully, moving forward, there can be changes implemented into restaurant life so that it really is, something that I always saw it as, which is a viable career, a professional career. Because it does take a lot of different skills to be a successful restaurant person. It's not an easy job. I don't think it's there's that horrible kind of stereotype that restaurant work is only done by out of work actors or uni students, and that's just crap. The people who are successful in our industry are definitely not that. They're wine and food and hospitality professionals without a doubt, and it does take a lot of skill to do that. So we obviously want to encourage great people to get into restaurants, and the only way we're going to do that, I think, is by having education and by having structure and having support around A, what it takes to be successful in the industry, and B, how you can do that, without honestly having to work 90 or 100 hours a week. There are always going to be people in the restaurant industry who do that, as long as they're the owners of the business and they're not forcing that upon every member of staff. There's a lot to be said for working hard. Don't get me wrong, but it can't be a standard. It can't be a norm. It has to be a choice. And so I think the problems and the disasters really that have occurred over the last 12 months have hopefully given a time for reflection and for pause, and the new wave is ahead, hopefully.
Well, and a part of that Grow Assembly will be back on. Is there anything that you can tell us about in regards to what we could expect yet?
Look, we don't have any dates or events confirmed that I can share with you at the moment. I guess probably the only sort of important change that we're making is that in continuation of our ethos of, I guess, wanting to support the hospitality industry, we're in the process of setting up I don't know if you'd call it a fund or a scholarship or something like that, that will be awarded annually to someone who lives and breathes hospitality in Australia. So a young hospitality professional some sort of cash and mentoring reward that we'll be able to offer on an annual basis to hopefully support people on their hospitality journey.
Wow. Well, that sounds amazing. And Banjo, has been absolutely incredible to have you on Deep in the Weeds. Look forward to seeing Grow Assembly and what you do with that in the future. Please keep in touch, and we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks so much, Anthony. It's a real pleasure to be able to chat. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.